Thank you. Next item of business is a debate on motion 3049, the name of Alistair Allen, on welcoming international migrants in Scotland. Can I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call Alistair Allen to speak to and move the motion. Minister, please, 12 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm honoured to be here today to acknowledge International Migrants Day 2016, which takes place this Sunday. To mark this day, the UN encourages us to share information on the rights and freedoms of migrants and to design actions to ensure their protection. So today, I hope not only to recognise the rights of migrants and Scotland's duty to offer a place of protection and safety, but also to send a warm message of welcome to all of those who have chosen to make Scotland their home. That message of welcome extends to all who have come to Scotland from other countries, whether they are seeking asylum and refuge, choosing to work or study here, or joining family here. So the motion is therefore using the word migrant in its widest sense. However, we must remember that all of these people are individuals with their own stories and their own sets of circumstances. And so I want to mark this day by highlighting the valuable contribution that migrants bring to Scotland's economy and the vibrancy that they bring to our society and culture. Following the EU referendum, it is more important than ever to stand up against negative rhetoric surrounding immigration and to strive to provide a welcoming and tolerant society for migrants in Scotland. To begin, I'm sure that members around the Chamber will join me in recognising Scotland's moral obligation to offer a place of safety to desperate people fleeing conflict and persecution. And it is with great sadness that I note the increasing number of fatalities in the Mediterranean since the beginning of 2016. The number of people who have tragically lost their lives this year in the Mediterranean whilst attempting to escape conflict or destitution has risen to 4,690, and this is some 1,225 more people than this time last year. But numbers like these, used so frequently to describe the size and scale of human tragedies, tend to strip away the humanity and subsequently the devastation caused by each individual death. So let me put this number into context. The number 4,690 is about 17%, or equivalent to about 17% of my constituency's population. That number includes men, women and children who were not fortunate enough to experience peace and a decent standard of living in their native countries. So let us remember these brave and courageous people today and focus on how we can support measures to ensure that migrants and refugees are protected in the future. Moving forward, it is essential that we work... I will, yes.
I'm very grateful to the
Liam
Minister.
MacArthur, sorry.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for taking an intervention, and I would certainly concur with the comments he's made to date. I don't know whether he's planning to turn to the situation in relation to the dismantling of the camp in Calais, but there's obviously been a great deal of concern around the welfare of unaccompanied children, and I think Parliament would benefit from an update on the steps being taken by the Scottish Government to secure the interests of those most vulnerable children and young people.
Minister.
Well, I very much agree with the sentiments that the member expresses there about the particular responsibility we all have towards unaccompanied children and the particularly concerning situation of people who have been through the experience they've been through in Calais. And certainly the Scottish Government has always made clear that we stand ready to do our share and more to welcome people from these and other difficult situations. There is much within the EU's actions that the Scottish Government can support also, such as the focus on taking action to save lives in the Mediterranean and the recognition that migration to Europe is a complex global issue with its roots in other countries. So I'm keen also to highlight, particularly in the current political climate, that European cooperation and not isolation is key to much of this. As members around the Chamber will know, last Saturday was Human Rights Day. On the 10th of December 1948, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which set out for the first time the fundamental human rights to which all people are entitled. While clear those rights belong equally to all people, this year the UN urges each one of us to step forward and defend the rights of particular groups of people, among those refugees and migrants. In Scotland, we are fortunate to live in a country where our human rights are generally respected, where the government and society more widely is committed to defending the existing human rights protections we have and to embedding human rights in everything that we do, where there are duties on public authorities to respect and implement human rights principles, and where an active civil society undertakes invaluable work to help make rights real in people's day-to-day lives. This places all of us under a moral obligation to respond to the United Nations call to stand up for the rights of other people, both at home and throughout the world. And I'm pleased to be able to say that in Scotland we have responded positively to this call. Now, the past 12 months have been a time of unprecedented change for refugee settlements in Scotland, for refugee resettlement in Scotland, as we have stepped up to play our part in responding to the refugee crisis. Scottish local authorities were quick to reflect the mood of the Scottish people by stating their willingness and desire to help, even though many had no previous experience in this area. But we've now received over 1,250 Syrian refugees under the Syrian resettlement programme since October 2015, which amounts to over 27% of all refugees settled in this scheme in the UK, and 29 local authorities have now received refugees in their areas. As I mentioned earlier, I also wish to focus today on the contribution that all migrants bring to Scotland, and to thank Scotland's migrant community for the diversity and wealth of experience that they bring to our country, as well as thanking people like COSLA, local authorities, Scottish Refugee Council and many others in Scotland who have worked to make this such a success. Unfortunately, divisive, misleading and inflammatory information regarding migration is all too easy to come across. It concerns me also that post the Brexit referendum, some people now believe it is socially acceptable to say some fairly extreme things, perhaps in ways that they didn't think would be accepted in the past. And contrary to this rhetoric, migrants are not a drain on society and can contribute significantly if they are given the same rights and opportunities as other citizens. The Scottish Government published 2 reports in October, one on the impacts and one on the characteristics of migration. These reports actually help, I think, to debunk many of those myths. For example, the claim that migrants are a strain on the benefits system. Our research disproved these claims and found that, in particular, our recent non-UK migrants are actually more likely to be in work than people born in Scotland. Another popular myth is that migrants force down wages. In reality, studies have found little or no impact on average wages as a result of migration. Any adverse effects on wages due to migration are actually likely to be greatest for workers who are themselves migrants. I will, yes.
Rossgrave, please.
I thank the Minister for taking that intervention. Would he agree that the main culprits of spreading this vile propaganda about both migrants and refugees are in fact right-wing tabloid newspapers such as The Sun, and we as politicians who represent and defend those people should distance ourselves from such vile claims?
Minister.
Well, it's certainly the case that all of us have a responsibility as politicians to make clear the positive message about what refugees, amongst many other migrants to this country, have contributed to this country, and to stand up to messages wherever they are found that try to make contrary claims. It's important to consider in doing that the evidence and how we can help to shape opinion in the future, because the impact of negative rhetoric on everyday lives of those who have chosen to make Scotland their home is something that should concern us. We must continue to call for an increased maturity and responsibility in how migration is discussed, and the onus is on all of us to be conscientious as we choose our words. In fact, the effect of what we might call an anti-migration discourse was raised at a recent focus group that I hosted for 11 EU nationals last month. And throughout our discussion, participants expressed unease with the language being used in some quarters to describe immigration. To many, this language represents a move towards dehumanisation and devalues individuals and their contribution. And these messages, along with the UK government's unwillingness to guarantee their rights following the referendum, had forced them to question if they even wanted, in some cases, to remain in the UK. And that included some people who had lived here for some 35 years. Presiding Officer, it is utterly disgraceful that the UK government has not yet guaranteed the immigration status of our non-UK EU nationals. And this has in turn created this feeling of apprehension which is affecting every aspect of their lives. For those EU nationals who have until now felt part and parcel of the fabric of our society, their nationality is now a constant reminder of how insecure their future might be. So today I wish to reiterate our message that Scotland's EU nationals are welcome here and that this remains your home. The contribution that you bring to our nation is valued, and we will continue to press the UK government to guarantee your rights. In the coming weeks, we will be presenting our proposition to protect Scotland's place in Europe and keep us in the single market. And remaining part of the single market means retaining freedom of movement. Those two things are, I believe,
the Minister's action is last minute, but I think we have a little...
If it's my last minute, I'll continue.
Oh, you're taking it, certainly. Thank you.
All right. OK, on you go.
Simply going to ask the Minister if he'd clarify as to whether the options paper he's just mentioned will be published before Christmas, because I think that was the commitment the First Minister gave to Parliament earlier in the year.
I can tell the member is urgently thumbing through his Advent calendar, but I refer to the commitments that were earlier given around that. I just want to conclude in that case by saying that I call on members here today to urge the UK government to stand by the rights of immigrants in Scotland from all parts of the world, and in particular Europe. And I also call on the UK government to treat our EU nationals with the respect and dignity that they deserve, and to guarantee the rights that they seek to remain in the UK. Our EU nationals need answers now, and that's why the Scottish Government will continue to stand up for their rights and for the rights of all others from other countries who have done us the honour of making Scotland their home.
Thank you, Minister. Call on Liam Kerr to speak to and move Amendment 3049.2. 7 minutes, please, Mr Kerr.
I beg your pardon, Deputy Presiding Officer, 7 minutes. Thank
7
you.
minutes, yes.
7. Thank
Were
you.
you expecting more?
I was rather.
Well, it's 7.
Of course. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. We need to talk about international migrants, but more than that, we need to listen. Alistair Allen talks of negative rhetoric, and I have 4 quotes just here. One from an SNP MSP, one from an SNP MP, one from an SNP councillor, and one from an SNP aide. All separately seek to suggest that being a member of the Conservative Party equals being anti-immigrant and anti-immigration. And another recently tweeted, "Tories don't care about vulnerable families. It is lazy dog whistle politics, base-level debating." So Mr Allen is absolutely right. We must be careful how we use language in this debate this afternoon. Let's have none of that here today. Now let's clear something else up. 17 million people exercised their democratic right to vote to leave the European Union, and that voting leave does not mean that those individuals are in any way racist. We must not forget that 1 million people in Scotland voted to leave, and they had legitimate reasons for doing so. And I do hope that the SNP will start to speak up for those who voted leave, as well as those who voted remain, around 38% of whom were famously SNP voters, of course. And stop with the casting aspersions on those who do accept the democratic result of the referendum, and try to work with the UK government to secure the best deal for the UK. I'll not take any intervention, I'm afraid. I'm 4 minutes short of where I thought I was, so...
I'll give you 30 seconds if you take an intervention, but it's up to you.
Take that, then.
Oh, it's a point of order, beg your pardon. Point of order, Ms. White.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Could you clarify or explain why this speech from the Conservatives over there has not even touched on actually what the motion is about?
I have to say, Ms White, I'm monitoring when the member will come to the material part of the amendment, and I'm sure he's moving on to it now.
Yes, the answer, of course, is because I was only 1.5 minutes into it. But let me make clear, then, where we agree with the motion. Do we welcome international migrants to Scotland? Of course we do. Britain, at its best, has for centuries been a shining light of democracy, liberty and hope, and we believe that our internationalism abroad must be echoed here at home. As Ruth Davidson has said many times in the debates on numbers and criteria and quotas and percentages, we must never forget that behind it all, behind the figures and the rules and the criteria, there are homes, families and human beings. So let me make clear, we wholeheartedly support the UN's International Migrants' Day, and we welcome that the motion clearly signals the status of refugees. But we must also acknowledge, as our First Amendment seeks to, that the UK government is on track to meet its target to resettle 20,000 Syrian refugees by 2020, that the UK government has pledged refugees will receive £8,500 per head for housing and healthcare in the year they arrive, along with lessons in the English language, and that the UK government has spent more than £2.3 billion on providing opportunities for work and access to services. But also that the majority of people who do become refugees don't want to leave their homes, their communities or their countries. They live in hope that one day they can return and rebuild their lives. So our First Amendment notes and pays tribute to the UK government, the Department for International Development, our aid workers and our staff from around the world. Britain is the second largest bilateral donor supporting Syrian refugees in that region. The UK has contributed £1.1 billion since 2012 on food, tents and other humanitarian aid. And the UK is giving a further £10 million to help vulnerable refugee minors already in Europe. The UK government has provided more funding for refugees than any other Western European government. It is a government less about gestures and more about the solid long-term work at the root of the problem that aims to prevent people taking life-threatening journeys and funding traffickers. So now I'll turn to economic migrants. And I join the Scottish Government in their motion as we make clear again and again what Ruth said to the Conservative Party conference in October. For those who have already chosen to build a life, open a business, make a contribution, I say this: this is your home and you are welcome here. And we also urge the UK government to guarantee the rights of EU nationals to live and work here. But as our next amendment proposes, this is two-way. The Prime Minister has to ensure that she looks out for the 1.2 million UK nationals, of whom 120,000 are Scots in the EU. That means we aspire to an open, reciprocal agreement where UK citizens in other EU countries would be guaranteed rights to remain, and in turn those from the EU who have already settled in the UK would receive the same guarantee. Mutual assurance for mutual benefit. This is, of course, a little different to the, quote, robust and common sense position that there are 160,000 EU nationals from other states living in Scotland, and if Scotland was outside Europe, they would lose the right to stay here. Not my words, but those of the First Minister in 2014. And I am pleased at reports that the EU may be relaxing its hardcore position. Just recently, we've heard prominent MEPs talk about possible associate citizenship of the EU. Now, that will require rigorous scrutiny and inspection, but let's hope the EU sees sense, confirms the status ASAP, and allows our government to make a reciprocal promise. And this is where we turn to our next amendment around non-EU migration and a future immigration system which would provide equal opportunities to live and work for migrants from out with the EU. I cannot imagine anyone here believes the UK should not have some form of border. Certainly, quote, nobody's suggesting uncontrolled and unmanaged immigration because we've got to get more of our own young folks staying here, maximising good jobs and more women in work as well. That was the First Minister again. If you start from that premise, you have to accept there must be some criteria under which people can and should enter. A controlled, transparent and efficient immigration system which includes a points-based approach. That will be the White Paper on Independence. That is a fair system in which the doors open to anyone who meets the criteria because they're currently not. Presiding Officer, we will always work to make this country a welcoming place for international migrants, but we must make the immigration system fair, one that works for all and one that is in the interest of our communities and country. Of course we acknowledge the UN's International Migrants' Day. Of course we remember the refugees that have lost their lives. Of course we celebrate the contribution that migrants have made. But it is incoherent for us to sit here and call upon the UK government to guarantee rights of EU nationals whilst not urging the EU to do the same for British migrants. This Parliament must note that non-EU migration is essential and a future, fairer immigration system can provide equal opportunities for all. Our amendment also notes the significant powers that the Scottish Government has at its disposal to create incentives to live and work in Scotland. And we must note the UK Government's aid and support programme, the second largest in the world.
And that's where to stop. I'm so sorry. You've done very well, Mr Kerr.
Thank you very much.
As you were misinformed by your whip. I now, please move your amendment.
Move the amendment in my name.
Excellent. I now call Lewis MacDonald to speak and move Amendment 3049.1. Mr MacDonald, I hope you were told it was 6 minutes.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Presiding Officer. When the United Nations established International Migrants' Day at the turn of the century, it declared that migration could be beneficial to all concerned. It could be good for migrants moving country to better themselves and to improve life chances for their families. It could benefit destination countries, bringing in new people to do jobs other people did not want, and gaining new residents, on average younger and more active than the people there already. And it could also be good for countries of origin. Migrants around the world sent over $400 billion home to their families last year, more than 3 times as much as all the world's development aid put together. That's the upside, but of course, it's not the whole story. Migrants can also be exploited and underpaid by employers, ripped off by landlords, trafficked into slavery or something like it, treated as expendable, or placed in mortal danger on the journey from one country to another, as we have already heard today. And countries of origin can lose their best qualified, most enterprising people, while older and poorer and less able citizens are left behind. One country's demographic solution can be another country's demographic disaster. And in destination countries, as the UN also says, migration may reduce wages or lead to higher unemployment among low-skilled workers in advanced economies, many of whom are themselves migrants who arrived in earlier waves. That is why it is right to manage migration and to do it in the context of wider society, protecting the rights and interests of new migrants and established residents alike. And of course, Scotland has been at both ends of the migrant journey. That point was made at the St Andrews Day rally in Aberdeen by Piotr Tiodorovsky, a local member of the Scottish Youth Parliament. He reminded us that when the merchant Robert Gordon was trading between Aberdeen and the Baltic region, there were thousands of Scots living and working in what is now Poland. Those Scottish migrants had gone to the other side of Europe in pursuit of opportunity. They were known, among other things, for their strong work ethic and for looking out for each other, much as Polish migrant workers are known in Scotland today. And some of those Polish migrants today work or study at the university which is named after the said Robert Gordon, founded with the profits of Scotland's Baltic trade 300 years ago. Every part of Scotland has a similar story to tell of outward migration in centuries past and inward migration in recent years. Some parts of Scotland, indeed, are still experiencing both at the same time. Jack McConnell, as First Minister a decade ago, saw that inward migration offered part of the answer to Scotland's demographic deficit, and his Fresh Talent initiative was so successful that it was extended by the then Labour government to the rest of the UK. That is important for a number of reasons. It is an example of managed migration and immigration policy tailored to Scotland's needs, including an incentive for overseas students to study at Scottish universities. An immigration policy for only one part of the United Kingdom, but supported by a UK government with overall immigration policy still decided at Westminster. Here was Scotland's devolved government leading the way and the rest of Britain following. And that example still matters today. After they scrapped post-study work visas across the UK in 2012, Tory ministers are now piloting a very modest variant at 4 English universities, prompted no doubt by the potentially devastating impact of Brexit on excellence in higher education. Perhaps more significantly, and also in the context of Brexit, the idea of enabling skilled migrants to work in only one part of the UK has been taken up elsewhere. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is exploring the idea of a regionally specific work permit to allow people to enter the UK in order to work in the Greater London region alone. And when members of this Parliament's European Committee met our counterparts from the London Assembly last month, they were keen that Scotland and London should work together to see if such schemes could be part of the answer to the challenges posed by Brexit. I hope ministers share that view, and I hope that they will work with the Mayor of London and with other devolved administrations to explore whether it is possible to devise a scheme of work permits specific to given nations or regions that could operate in the context of the UK as a whole. The outcome of the EU referendum has changed the picture profoundly as far as European migration into the UK is concerned, and indeed for migration from here to other European countries. And we've heard important words about the need to support the position of migrants from other European Union countries, resident here or moving here over the next 2 years, and indeed beyond that. That message to migrants into Scotland from other European Union countries is important, and to say that they should be used simply as a bargaining chip is not acceptable. The Tory amendment today talks of levelling up the opportunities for migration from non-EU countries, but in reality, UK Tory policy is much more likely to level down opportunities for migration to and from our nearest neighbours, potentially doubling the number of people who will require some kind of visa or permission to enter the UK. We should reject the folly of Tory plans to impose artificial caps on inward migration, taking no account of our demographic deficit or economic needs. We should instead embrace managed migration to grow Scotland's skills base and our economically active population, and explore all means to do so within the context of the United Kingdom. And to that end, I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much, Mr MacDonald. Can I ask all members who wish to speak in the open debate to make sure they've pressed the request to speak buttons? I now call James Dornan to be followed by Alexander Stewart. Mr Dornan, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you for your indulgence about letting me leave after my speech. On the morning of October the 3rd, 2013, a fishing boat leaves Tripoli. It's a small wooden boat like a child's drawing with a high wheelhouse. It is old, worn out, no one can remember its name. Fish are scarce and its owner would have been happy to get rid of it for a handful of sticky notes. On board are 520 passengers. They pack every inch of the hold, a biblical human fish, and they stand crammed on deck. Each is paid about $1,600 for the one-way trip. It's a calm, warm day. The tideless Mediterranean is blue. The rickety engine warbles and chokes, slowly pushing north. Its destination is Lampedusa. This is the last journey, whatever the outcome. The boat is a disposable bark with a disposable cargo. Eritreans mostly, some Somalians and Syrians, with a couple of Tunisians, men and women and children. There are 41 unaccompanied minors. The youngest is 11. They look back at their last view of Africa. The distinction between an economic migrant and a refugee is simple. Are you running from or to? And all these souls are escaping. On the night of October the 3rd, that same old fishing boat with its exhausted passengers ran out of steam and fuel. They wouldn't normally have expected to get this far. As a practice rule, the Italian Coast Guard tracks and picks up the trafficking boats at sea and transfers the refugees to the small port in the town. These arts usually call ahead on satellite phones or shortwave radios, and it's an organised and familiar run, except not this time. There was no call, and somehow no one noticed the blip of 500 Africans on the radar. The boat began to drift towards a cliff. Someone set fire to a blanket to attract help. They could see the lights on the shore. The passengers were tired and frightened, and so close to the promised land, they panicked and moved to one side of the ship, which swayed, yawed, lost its slippery balance, and capsized. 368 Africans drowned. When the refugees are brought ashore, they're given a medical check and their names are taken. Then they're bused to a camp in the outskirts of town that's been pushed into a thin, dead-end valley, 2-storey blocks of dormitories and an administration building surrounded by a chain-link fence. The dormitories are packed. There's barely enough room to walk between the beds. The walls are covered in hopeful religious graffiti and names. The place smells of sewage and sweat. There are no dining facilities. Refugees squat in the open or eat in their beds. There's a small area set aside for nursing mothers. Otherwise, there's one lavatory for 100 women. And a Syrian complains that she hasn't been able to go to the loo for days because the door doesn't have a lock and there are always men there. That is the reality of the people who are trying hard to come to this country for a decent life. They're not coming here as economic migrants trying to steal our jobs. They're not coming here to take away our public services. They're coming here because life in their own country has become completely and utterly unbearable. If we remember young Aileen Curdy, that poor boy, the photos of him when it hit the media, the world responded with a collective gasp. People could see that real children who once had lives, feelings and a family were just being washed up on the shore like they were part of a shipwreck. And as we look forward to the UN's International Migrants Day next week, I am proud to be part of a government and a parliament and a country who sought out ways to save refugees, who responded to that crisis with compassion and welcoming arms. When the First Minister committed to taking over 1,200 refugees as a starting point, it became apparent that local authorities would be tasked with rehoming and integrating these new members of Scottish society. The last figures released showed that 29 out of 32 local authorities had taken in a proportion of refugees, and it's to their credit that this work was carried out quickly and timely adjustments made in response to the urgency of the appeal. And of course, we also have to congratulate the many third sector and religious organisations who also helped the refugees adapt to life in a strange country. And education has a role to play in the adjustment for the lives of these vulnerable children who have arrived on our shores. Teachers have the challenging task of being a constant in the life of these children, sometimes the only one, while at the same time aiding them as they grasp the English language and Scottish customs, which can be so unfamiliar to their young lives. Kids can and do adapt well. Very recently, my office had the joy of meeting a young man, Hassan Ibrahim, whose family had fled from war-torn Iraq. He learned English from watching box sets of Friends, went on to obtain outstanding grades at high school, but was faced with a challenge when it came to university funding. And as a young asylum seeker, funding can be a sticking point. But to the great credit of student support and the wellbeing team, along with additional backup from the Institute of Pharmacy and Biological Sciences, both based at Strathclyde University, Hassan now has a place studying chemistry. When he's qualified, there is no telling what skills he could bring to in the way this we shape our nation. Another great news story of how migrants and refugees enrich the fabric of our society. Migrants really do bring so many gifts. Scotland has a tapestry of colourful cultures due to years of migration from all over the world. And of course, we cannot speak of how wonderful it is to welcome refugees and migrants into our society without touching again on some of the brutal stories which these people faced before they had fled. Atrocities on an unimaginable scale were committed to some of these people. Atrocities will leave them damaged and traumatised for the rest of their lives. A young woman who came to Scotland with 2 young girls was shown her new living arrangements. She was led to a balcony and she made the comment that it was bigger than where she had lived before. Staff thought she meant the whole house, but no, she was referring to the balcony. She'd been surviving with her 2 girls in a chicken coop. It's unimaginable to think of that woman living like that while bombs fell around her beautiful daughters. There's a number of issues. The quotes that I started from came from an article by A.A. Gill, who unfortunately passed away just last week. And I want to quote from something else that he said in that article. Most of the Eritrean men I spoke to have been imprisoned in Libya or held hostage in the Sahara, all beaten, all tortured. They knew others who had died of thirst, of beatings, of starvations. The girls who had been raped, whole families abandoned in the desert, disappeared under the sand. They tell the stories with a matter-of-fact fatalism. Please tell the world about Libya. They are dying in prison. I would suggest that
I just asked you to conclude there. It's a good quote to end with, Mr Dornan.
Thank you very much.
Please sit down. Thank you.
Thank you very much for saying that.
Thank you.
I would suggest that when we have, when we're talking about this, we are very careful with the language. No, sorry, Mr Dornan. Please sit down. It was a good quote to end with. Don't spoil it. I call Alexander Stewart, followed by Joan McAlpine. Mr Stewart, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I should like to start today by recognising the considerable contribution to Scotland that many migrants and people from across the world make. Many play vital roles in our health sector and education services, as well as many sectors in our economy, and that's something that we should welcome. They play a vital role in our culture, our economy and our way of life. Since the United Kingdom made the decision to leave the European Union earlier this year, many in this chamber and out with have sought to portray this decision as somehow inward-looking. But in fact, it is quite the contrary. We are looking forward to the possibilities and the opportunities that exist now and in the future. And when I campaigned during that, I made it quite clear that what was needed was not no immigration to the United Kingdom, but we have some control over the migration that takes place. We need a system that did not allow for unlimited migration, but rather one that would plug some of the skill gaps that we face within the economy. As a result of being part of the European area of freedom and movement, our current immigration system not only prevents us from doing that, but it also is unfairly focusing on disadvantage, and we are not able to then deal with people from the rest of the world. Shirley?
Daniel Johnson.
In the context of this debate, celebrating UN Migration Day is not entirely unhelpful to describe immigration as being good and bad, as his statement seems to imply so far.
Alexander Stewart.
No, I certainly did not do that. I will continue, Presiding Officer. As I said, during the referendum, I and many others argued for a new immigration system that would ensure the best and the brightest people from around the world would have the opportunity to come to this part of the country. And I think that's very important. Surely.
Minister.
Does he really think that the tone struck by certain quarters in the Leave campaign was really urging for wider immigration beyond the EU and celebrating its potential contribution to our country?
Mr Stewart.
The Minister makes a valid point, but individuals had the right to put forward their case, and they did that during the referendum. And as I said, we had a result at the end of the day which we have to represent and respect, and I do that. However, I'm very disappointed by the posturing of the First Minister over what she purports to the threat of the EU citizens who currently live in Scotland. The Leave campaign was absolutely categorical when it stated that the value and the contribution of people from the EU currently living in the United Kingdom and that they should be allowed to remain so post-Brexit. This is extremely from the UK government considering, and it's exactly where the UK government is when looking at this topic. They want to ensure that expatriates who live in other parts of the European Union are granted that. And that's the only reason, Deputy Presiding Officer, that such an agreement has not yet formally been reached, because the EU refused to negotiate any of this prior to triggering of Article 50. And that's where we find ourselves, which already has been mentioned in this chamber already. We cannot and are not able to because of the situation we find ourselves in. So you've asked many questions in this chamber about that in the past when we've had other debates, but it's because nothing can happen until Article 50 is triggered. Moreover, the Scottish National Party have somewhat hypocritical when it comes to immigration and migration. The chamber might be interested to know that in the Scottish independence referendum, it was indicated, and I quote, there are 160,000 EU nationals from other states living in Scotland. If Scotland was outside Europe, they would lose the right to stay here. That was from the First Minister. No spokespersons from officials of the Leave campaign made such threats during the campaign at all. It is also very important that we look out at our own labour force and encourage those greater participation within our own economy. The Scottish Nationalist Party record in government in doing this is quite unbelievable. Take, for example, the rate of economic activity within Scotland stands at 37.9% compared to 36.4% in the rest of the UK. And over the course of the SNP time, there's 176,000 people have become economically inactive in Scotland during their tenure. Time is short, and I've given way already twice. Long-term unemployment, Deputy Presiding Officer, is a measure that looks at individuals who have been unemployed for over a year. And we see that 2% higher in Scotland than the rest of the UK. We need to start addressing these issues on economic activity at home, encouraging more people to get back into the workplace and ensuring that people who live in Scotland have the opportunity to be employed. And that is important. As I said at the outset, individuals who come to this country, who migrate into this country, participate in our own culture, in our lifestyle, and that is absolutely fantastic, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I'm not against any of that, but I want to ensure that our own system here is working as well. And at the moment, under this government, it is not. I would also like to take the opportunity to address the ludicrous situation that has been suggested by the SNP, that there should be some different criteria in different parts of the UK when it comes to the whole idea of managing this. No,
the member's in his last 30 seconds.
I'm in my last 30 seconds, and I've taken a number already. So, to conclude, Deputy Presiding Officer, on these benches, I am sure that everyone across this chamber welcome the contribution that international migrants have made to Scotland and our culture. And they do, and as I've said already, they have made a fantastic contribution to where we are and what we're trying to achieve. But it's also important that we also take into account the genuine concerns that some people have in Scotland about migration and immigration. We cannot ignore them, and we have to then look at how we manage the situation going forward and ensuring the best and the brightest from all over the world have the opportunity to come here and benefit from where we take it.
Thank you very much, Mr Stewart. I call Joan McAlpine to be followed by Pauline McNeill. Ms McAlpine, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I would point out to the last speaker that during the referendum, one of the leading Leave campaigners Mr Gove wrote to the First Minister and suggested that Scotland could have its own migration system, and I would certainly ask him to pay attention to the work of the committee and to the comments made by Lewis MacDonald in his very considered speech earlier on. I'm delighted to speak in this afternoon's debate on such an important topic. International Migrants Day on the 18th of December gives us the chance to pause and reflect on just what migration means to us here in Scotland and across the world. If you visit the United Nations website, they have a page devoted to International Migrants Day, and in the first paragraph it reads, "Throughout human history, migration has been a courageous expression of the individual's will to overcome adversity and to live a better life." This is true today more than ever, and I'm glad that the motion gives us the chance to celebrate the contribution of those migrants who have chosen to make Scotland their home. In the wake of Brexit, it is important to counter those who did stir up fears of migration for political ends, and to remember just how important migration has been for Scotland. As Lewis MacDonald has already alluded to, last week's meeting of the Europe Committee was a session solely focused on the impact of migration, specifically from EU countries, and figures provided by the Scottish Parliament Information Service ahead of the meeting told us that there were an estimated 181 EU nationals resident in Scotland, the majority from accession nations. Colin Wilson of Fife Migrants Forum provided the committee with some compelling evidence of the importance of migrants to the Scottish economy. He said that many of the migrants we get here in Scotland may begin their stay here working in low-paid jobs, but are well qualified and able to do a lot more than that. And because they're ambitious, once they get to grips with the local knowledge and put down roots, they move into higher skilled jobs, and this is a great stimulus for the economy. He gave a striking example from Kirkcaldy, where he works. The high street there has challenges, as high streets everywhere in Scotland and the UK are experiencing. But now he said it's on the road to recovery, with 7 or 8 businesses set up by migrants who have made their homes in Fife. And while the numbers of these small businesses are not huge, they're still providing employment, and of course they're bringing much needed regeneration to the town centre. The committee also took evidence from Kirsty McLachlan of the National Records of Scotland, who warned us that if we are not to have migration, the age structure of the population would be affected. While it's of course a good thing that people are living longer, population ageing brings with it considerable challenges. EU migrants are typically young and economically active, which helps us to deal with these challenges. With no EU migration, her model showed that the number of people of working age in Scotland is expected to fall by 3% between 2014 and 2039, compared to a rise of 28% in those of pension age. And that model is actually much worse for Scotland than it is for the rest of the UK with zero migration, because fertility is higher in the rest of the UK. Although they are obviously adversely affected as well. Now, this is obviously a worst-case scenario, but it does show how much we need EU migration here in Scotland, and just how wrong the UK government's approach to reducing net migration, regardless of the contribution made, is. I'm pleased that the motion gives us the chance to remember those refugees and migrants who have lost their lives while trying to reach safe harbour. As the UN website says, refugees and migrants are trying to reach our shores for a better life, but tragically there are many who do not make it. Remembering those who have lost their lives on the journey is something that we should do every day, not just on International Migrants Day. Indeed, there are many groups across Scotland who do just that. Massive Outpouring of Love, a group in Dumfries in my South of Scotland region, was set up by volunteers last year in response to the growing refugee crisis, and it's still going strong. Last August, they launched an appeal for warm clothing, bedding, food and tents. All were and still are needed by desperate people fleeing wars to reach safety. The collections are still going strong, and it's a testament to the fact that people have not been forgotten, and Scottish people have not forgotten those who have lost their lives or who still need help today. And the majority of people empathise with the plight of those refugees, as well as other migrants. And in today's climate, it can sometimes be easy to forget that those on the far right who identify with racist messages and spread racist messages are in fact a minority. I want to end with a quote from Colin Wilson on EU migration from last week's committee meeting, which I think is very fitting. He said, "The beauty of the European Union is that we have stopped talking about national borders and started looking at people. and that we now have an ebb and flow of migrants and people from all different cultures mixing with one another and enjoying one another's company. That has been one of the great things about Scotland. People from the rest of Europe feel that they are accepted here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms McAlpine. I call Pauline McNeill to be followed by Sandra White. Ms McNeill, please.
Presiding Officer, international migration is probably the most topical issue right now, and that means that I think we have a duty as politicians and leaders to combat some of the terrible and dreadful negative rhetoric that we've heard. I wholeheartedly agree with Alistair Allen in his contribution. But we know we have issues, to challenge politicians in this whole debate. Brexit, there's no doubt that it was a #1 issue for people who voted. And the danger of the terrorism which we're leaving is that we leave our country more isolated than it previously was. The rise of right-wing parties across Europe exploiting that negative rhetoric is a dangerous precedence, inflamed by some of the media reports who create myths around immigration. In fact, people actually believe there's twice as many immigrants living here than there actually are. So I think the press have a lot to answer for here. But that means that we have to have real political leadership to combat many of these myths. But we also must have a deeper analysis. There are clearly concerns about immigration, and I think it would be wrong to ignore that. But I think in our reflections, I think we have to show leadership, but at the same time listen and understand. I'm fully behind the government motion. It was Pope Francis who said it's not the migrants that are the danger, it's the migrants who are in serious danger. And that's what concerns me about what I've heard from the Tory benches and their contributions so far, as echoed by Daniel Johnson. It's not that I disagree with the proposition that migrants, of course, bring many positive benefits to our country, but I want to hear some more words about why it is that many of the refugees and migrants coming here from Syria, Iraq and Afghanistan come here because they're trying to save their lives and create a life here. There's a moral responsibility and a moral duty of our country to look after many of those people who choose to make Scotland their home. But equally, we cannot be complacent in Scotland. Different attitudes to the rest of the UK don't really exist that much. 49% of people in Scotland want to see less immigration, which is the same proportion as across the UK. When it comes to social cohesion, it's the pace of change which concerns some communities. And interestingly, when you look at the Brexit result, it's striking that the areas where the highest levels of immigration who voted strongly for Remain, but those where they experienced the fastest pace of change voted strongly to leave. So who are these refugees? As I've said, the highest numbers are from Syria, #1, Iraq, #2, and Afghanistan, #3. And as we know, most of the responsibility is borne by the countries surrounding those countries. Lebanon, a tiny country of 5 million people, I suppose about the same size as Scotland, has 1 in 4 are refugees. And I was in Lebanon recently, and some of the local people tell me it's probably as near to 1 in 3. Jordan, which has a GDP of 1.2% the size of the United Kingdom, has 1.5 million refugees within its borders. I think it's worthy of mention the Syrian conflict itself, probably the most complex conflict of our time. And only today, the poor people of eastern Aleppo, where the military are about to fall to the government forces, and reports of massacres of millions of unarmed civilians. Unfortunately, in eastern Aleppo, those people cannot flee, but would if they could. A multi-proxy war, including the superpowers, whose interests seem to be actually much more important than the innocent civilians who are caught up in it. The biggest driver of migration is this conflict. 11 million Syrians are displaced. We're involved in this conflict. We are bombing Syrians. We have to take some moral responsibility for the consequences. And that is one of the leadership issues as politicians we need to take to the public, because we're involved in Yemen. We are involved, or were involved, in Afghanistan and Iraq, where these refugees are coming from. There are consequences of war. I think it was the Liberal Democrat benches who mentioned the very, very important issue of child migrants. I was in Cali, in the jungle, shortly before it closed. It is one of the most heartbreaking things to see the number of children who have simply fled, and you really don't know what's happened to them now. The Home Office transfers of unaccompanied minors who were registered in the Cali refugee camp are still 1,000 of them, and they've been told that they will not be given sanctuary. Alf Stubbs, the Labour peer who has championed this cause, said recently, "I'm dismayed to learn that transfers are about to cease, having only just begun. Had the bridge been pulled up so soon after the start of the kinder transport through which my life was saved, many of us would never have made it to Britain at all." According to UNICEF, there are 2.6 million children who are no longer in school. 2 million are living as refugees. They're on the run, they are not safe, and they're being targeted for abduction. I mean, what greater moral case can you make for doing more to ensure that child migrants have a place to go? So I believe that the government position is the right one. There are many, many positive benefits, and I will close, Presiding Officer, on this. It's interestingly that migrants, much to maybe the myths that we might hear, pay more in taxes than they actually receive in benefits. It's the skills gap, the ageing population, the pension gap, and many, many positive reasons. EU nationals need answers. They need to know that Scotland is their chosen home, that they're safe here. They need that security. We have a job to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms McNeill. I call Sandra White, to be followed by Ross Greer. Ms White, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. We have a very famous author and commentator, Willie McIlvany, who said, "We are a nation of mongrels." And Scotland was built up on that, as was the rest of the UK, as was many, many other countries in this world also. So migration, as Polly McNeill has already mentioned, has been going on for thousands of years, and we welcome migrants into our country. That's why I welcome the opportunity to highlight the positive contribution of international migrants, particularly in my own constituency of Glasgow Kelvin. And I do applaud the community and groups for the support they have actually shown to EU nationals and within my community and migrants also. Basically, they are global citizens and they live and work in Glasgow. And they're very much supported by the local community. I also want to endorse this year's International Migrants Day, December the 18th, and commend the International Organisation for Migration and their call to the international community to come together and remember the refugees and migrants who have tragically lost their lives this year, fleeing from their homes, seeking safety and protection. And I commend Polly McNeill and her contribution, because she's absolutely right. They're fleeing war, and most of the war has been caused by the West. And it's not because of the sake of the people. It's because for riches, oil, or whatever it may be. And we have a responsibility to basically tell the truth about that. We have a responsibility to also take these migrants, refugees, into our countries as well. Now, Glasgow, as we all know, and other areas too, but I want to concentrate on Glasgow for this one, has a very rich history of welcoming migrants, and attitudes towards immigration across Scotland are certainly more positive, unfortunately, than the rest of the UK, if you see what has been said in the media and so forth. We have made those migrants and refugees who have arrived here feel very welcome, from lessons in the local dialect, and I won't say the local Glaswegian dialect you can expect, to sharing local foods. It is these small things that people may see as small actions that really go to a very long way for an inclusive and tolerant society. All across my constituency, we have a wide and varied mix of migrants, adding to the cultural, social and economic fabric of the local community. If I could just give you some examples, and apologise to others that I haven't been able to mention. We've got the award-winning North Star Cafe. It's owned by Mrs. and Mr. Rossini, originally from Italy, and there's many, many migrants who have made their homes here in the past, 100 years from Italy. And they are now business owners in Queen Margaret Drive in my constituency. The Little Cafe, excellent, down at Kelvin Grove, owned by Erson Sheffrey, who made Scotland his home after fleeing Kosovo, and his mother is actually one of the Women of the Year from the Evening Times Awards. Fantastic family, all made Glasgow their home and have contributed greatly. Another one called the Grunting Growler, owned by Jihad Hatu, who has made Scotland his home and contributes greatly to our local communities. I think we've really got to remember that migration is crucial to Scotland thriving. This has been indicated in recent research, I think it's been mentioned by perhaps the Minister, which shows our migrant workforce makes a positive contribution to local economies, and many sectors are really reliant on migrant labour. And we really must look to a more flexible approach to immigration. I mean, people over here, for the Tories, they seem to think we can't do that. But Scotland is different. We need migration. One size does not fit all. We need to look at a different approach to immigration for our country as well. And the UK government's strategy to reducing net migration will have a lasting and damaging effect on Scotland, severely reduce our ability for economic growth, as well as the cultural and social impact that myself and others have already mentioned. Presiding Officer, my constituency is home to all of the Glasgow universities, and therefore we're also home to many EU national students. And the Scottish Government has confirmed, and I'm pleased about this, all those currently studying will continue to receive free tuition for the duration of their studies. But there are very many uncertain times, and worried people who study and also work within our universities. The Brexit shamble that is continuing, basically, does not instill any confidence into the people who are worried already at the moment. Now, if I could just quote some figures, our higher education system is home to 13,450 students of EU domicile, 5,390 EU students at postgraduate level paying fees to do so, 16.7% of postgraduate research students, 4,600 EU staff working. And this is working and contributing as well in our 19 higher education institutions, and 23% of Scotland's research-only staff are from the EU. Very, very important to mention that. And I do echo Lewis MacDonald's concerns within that particular area of education. Presiding Officer, knowledge knows no bounds. I'm just going to finish this. Knows no bounds, and research crosses borders. Freedom of movement is essential for students and also people migration to ensure that everyone benefits for a greater learning experience. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Ms White. I call Ross Greer to be followed by Tavish Scott. Mr Greer, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to celebrate the contribution of everyone who has made their home here, whether they've come of their own choice from elsewhere in Europe or across the world, or whether they're a refugee seeking sanctuary in our country. Scotland's internationalist tradition has in many ways long made us a welcoming home for those who've come here. During the Second World War, many Polish servicemen came to Scotland to help defend our coastline long after their country had fallen to the Nazis. Many of those servicemen stayed. They raised families here, they contributed to the local communities, and they are firmly a part of Scotland's history and our community today. Indeed, today, almost half of EU nationals living in this country are from Poland, having largely arrived since their accession to the European Union. And it was only a few weeks ago that this Parliament celebrated the arrival of the 1,000th Syrian refugee to Scotland, leading the way across these islands in responding to the crisis of human misery that conflict has unleashed. But we should not for a second pretend that Scotland is a utopia of multiculturalism, a society free of bigotry, where everyone is guaranteed a warm welcome. We don't have to look too far into our past to see the discrimination that the Irish community faced, for example. And while there was not the surge in hate crime after the Brexit vote here that we saw elsewhere in the UK, indeed it looks like there was actually a bit of a decrease, there were still over 120 recorded hate crimes reported to police in the week after the vote. There is clearly still work to be done to ensure that every new arrival in Scotland, everyone who's chosen to make their home here or whose circumstances have brought them here out of necessity, is welcomed, is valued and respected. I'm glad to see that in my own region, East Bartonshire Council has recently agreed to open its doors to refugees from Syria and is working on resettling its first 4 Syrian refugee families. I and the community hope that they're the first of many. I should pay tribute to my colleague Rona Mackay. Between us, we spent a considerable amount of time putting pressure on the Council to join the 29 others who had already taken in Syrian refugees. And there are organisations across the length and breadth of this country who are making progress in this area. The Scottish Refugee Council, for example, has published a guide for housing professionals to help ensure that those arriving in this country can rest with a safe roof over their head and begin to build their lives here. There are also concerted efforts from the third sector, from voluntary organisations, to help new arrivals access the range of services that we all need, from healthcare to financial advice. But unfortunately, the immigration and asylum systems that we currently operate under, those of the UK government, do not offer the safety, the security, or even the dignity that we would want for those arriving in our country. With accommodation and support services being provided by heartless multinational providers such as Serco and their subcontractors, we've seen decisions taken that prioritise cost savings over providing decent shelter or even basic human dignity to those most in need of it. In Glasgow, we've heard of atrocious living conditions in substandard housing provided by the firm Orchard and Shipman. They've been the subject of numerous allegations of putting vulnerable people in slum-like accommodation. Health professionals and charities say the health of refugees, particularly of children, has suffered by living in such strained conditions. The UK system does not respect human dignity of those who came here seeking refuge, who fled war, persecution or disaster. Devolving the provision of asylum accommodation and services to the Scottish Government, though, would allow for public sector bids to provide decent services in a compassionate way. And I'd be keen to hear what steps the Scottish Government's taken to press the UK Government to devolve these responsibilities since this Parliament passed the Green Amendment on that matter during our debate on the Syrian refugee resettlement scheme. As recent weeks have also shown, the UK immigration system also fails to recognise the absolute economic necessity of inward migration to Scotland, being as we are a country with an ageing population and significant skills gaps. Projections from the National Records of Scotland estimate that halting future immigration from the EU would see a 12% drop in the 16 to 29-year-old population, double the decline that would be seen across the UK as a whole, and a significant blow to our working age population. Indeed, the total working age population under that Brexit scenario is projected to decline by 3% in Scotland, a drop not experienced in any other part of the UK. We benefit far more from the opportunities that freedom of movement has provided us. And we must value the contribution that EU migrants bring to our economy and appreciate how their skills enrich in our workplaces, our public services and our communities. All of us in this Parliament, though, I'm sure, are familiar with cases of constituents from elsewhere in the world coming to us because of bizarre, unfair or downright cruel decisions taken by the Home Office in regards to their right to stay here or that of their family. And that's why I read the amendment from the Conservatives with some confusion. Taking on board that the UK operates a thoroughly broken, discredited and unfair immigration system for non-EU citizens, I'm still confused by what they mean by a future fairer immigration system. Surely Conservative members are not suggesting that bringing EU citizens into the fold of the current broken system for the rest of the world is in any way fairer. It might be equally unfair, but that's about as generous as we can be. Indeed, in the last few days, we've seen proposals to half the number of international student visas, because nothing says we've taken back control like a body blow to our universities. But I suppose we're sick of experts anyway. Why would we want more of them? We must continue to welcome those who've chosen to make Scotland their home and guarantee the right of our fellow EU citizens who do already call Scotland their home. This Parliament and the people of Scotland would benefit significantly from the power to do so, and I hope that it's one that we'll see soon.
Tavish Scott, followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. A very good friend of 30 years passing is working in Uganda in the aid world at the moment. He emailed me last night to say that hundreds of thousands of people are refugees across and into the Ugandan border at this time. It's getting absolutely no news coverage here at all in the West and more broadly at all. And yet that is the reality of certain and different parts of Africa. I just highlight that because I think occasionally we get very exercised, or some in our politics and some in our society get very exercised by a very few number of people. When mass movements of refugees are happening in incredible scale in other parts of the world, and we know nothing or little of it. The other aspect I can't fail to stress this afternoon is that the UN today are describing what is, I suppose, appropriate to say is the total meltdown in humanity. There are children trapped in buildings under attack in Aleppo right now. And I think it's occasionally important to remember that we're pretty fortunate being in a pretty stable, grown-up, mature democracy, while others at the moment are losing their lives. So there'll be many more incidents that James Dornan mentioned in his remarks earlier on. There'll be many more people lost in the Mediterranean this next year. And as the President-elect of the United States appoints Rex Tillerson, the boss of ExxonMobil, as the Secretary of State, who is a close personal friend of Putin, I think we all in our politics need to be alive to the reality of a very different and changing world order. Pauline McNeill rightly mentioned earlier on the vibrancy of the language used in different parts of the European Union on immigration at the moment. There are candidates for the presidency of the French Republic who are now openly describing immigration controls and look like being in the runner for that. This world is changing around us. This world around refugees and immigration is changing around us. I agreed with much of what Alistair Allen made in his opening ministerial address. I thought he got that tone absolutely right, and Lewis MacDonald also made a series of remarks I entirely endorsed. Much of what we achieved with Fresh Talent gets obliterated as time goes on, but actually it was a good programme. And I think, in fairness, there were many friends, colleagues across other benches in Parliament at that time who recognised that. My most difficult conversation, straight up, my most difficult conversation in the Scottish elections back in May was not about domestic politics. It was by two young working guys who took me to task on immigration on a building site when I was, well, supposedly cheerfully canvassing. I wasn't very cheerful after I had that conversation, but tackling them, and I thought there's no way to do this immigration discussion. You can't hide away from it. You've got to take it head on. And the only way I got them to at least move their thinking was describing, and Pauline McNeill mentioned Jordan, was describing a discussion I'd had about 5 years ago, or less possibly, in the last Parliament anyway, with the Jordanian Minister of something who was in Parliament here meeting people from across the political parties. And he graphically illustrated to me the challenges for his country of dealing with 1.5 million refugees from different parts of the Middle East, particularly Syria, given that war has now been going on so long, and what that meant for his country and the demands that were placed on that country. And I explained all these to these two young working men in Shetland, and they conceded that our perspective on these things, if nothing else, was limited by the reality of what was happening even in Shetland, compared to the sheer enormous challenge of coping with that kind of influx of people fleeing war in Jordan. I also want to mention, there's a member of my own staff who's EU national. I know there'll be other colleagues across politics here who also have people who are EU nationals working for them here in Edinburgh. So I am very strong in my commitment, as others have been, and the Minister started rightly, in my commitment to making sure that in this mess that is Brexit, the position of EU citizens is guaranteed for the future. I don't think it's good enough, and I would disagree profoundly with Alistair Stewart's comments earlier on. It's not good enough to just simply say that the government can't do anything until the UK government can't do anything because the EU won't let them until Article 50 triggers. Absolute rubbish. The Prime Minister could stand up and make a very clear statement about the position of these people in our country, and she should. And she should. Alistair may have watched a different referendum than the one I remember seeing back in the summer. But Liam Kerr, the one thing I absolutely agreed with Liam Kerr on is language does matter. Language has got debased by what's gone on of late. And we need to get back to a position where language actually does matter, and how we conduct ourselves on this issue above all else is profoundly important. Can I just finish with one plea to the Minister? I wasn't trying to crack a joke or anything about the Brexit options paper. I genuinely believed that the government had made a commitment to bringing that back before Parliament before the end of the year, and I hope you'll just confirm that will happen. Not least of which because it would be an important chance to make the same point again about the importance of EU nationals, in Scotland and across the UK, and their right to be here.
I call on Jamie Green to be followed by Tom Arthur.
Presiding Officer, the UN's International Migrant Day on December 18th is observed to recognise the efforts, contributions and the rights of migrants worldwide. But as the Migration Observatory of the University of Oxford pointed out in its briefing, there is no single definition for what a person, what type of person makes a migrant. To a researcher, a migrant may be one type of person, to a lawyer another, and clearly to a politician another. Which is why I think in debates like this we must be very careful not to throw terms like immigrant, refugee, migrant or asylum seeker around as if each word is entirely interchangeable with the other. I think the... Pardon? Is that an intervention? Or? I think the government's motion today, are willing to take it.
Claire Adamson.
Just don't recognise that mix-up, if you like, that distinction on these benches, and certainly not from the Labour benches, from the contributions I've heard today.
Jamie Green.
I think my point is entirely proved by the wording of the government's motion. There's very little to disagree in, actually, I'll be honest with you, but it is very jumbled in the way that it interchanges migrants, immigrants, economic migration and refugees. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail, if you would let me. What is a migrant? A migrant can be someone who's displaced from their home country due to poverty and conflict. And I think James Dornan actually painted a very eloquent picture of that tragic circumstance. But there are also migrants who choose to move from one country to another to create a better life for their families. The generations of my own family left Scotland and moved to Canada to seek a better life, and the majority of them are still there. They weren't escaping or fleeing from war, but they were wanting a better life, an economic life for their children. So when we discuss migration in Scotland, and indeed the UK, I think we must first agree upon some common principles for this discussion. Scotland is a welcoming country, and I'm proud of the welcome that we have given migrants arriving here in crises. No one is disputing that. But there is no doubt that there is a need for economic migration into Scotland across all skill levels, and no one on these benches is disputing that either. But more importantly, Presiding Officer, let's not confuse the challenges of welcoming refugees into society to the genuine need to recruit the best talent from anywhere in the globe. By way of example, I spoke to a tech business in Edinburgh recently that was struggling to recruit software engineers and developers, most of them from India, under the current visa system. In the absence of enough suitably skilled workers, that MD is forced to recruit from afar if he wants his business to grow. And from personal experience, I know what it feels like to have to leave your home, job, friends and partner behind when your visa runs out. After a year in Australia, the government there decided that I did not have the skill set that they needed at that point in time to allow me to stay in their country. And it was tough to leave. But in the passage of time, I've come to respect their decision and their system. So I'm not here to discuss the merits of one immigration system over another, but I make this point to demonstrate that we as a Parliament should be having a grown-up debate about the skills we need as a country and how we manage inward migration. I think Pauline McNeill made a very valid contribution in that about social cohesion, and it's a problem that's not just unique to Scotland. The government motion also talks about refugees, a very different type of migrant. When it comes to forced migration, conflict, climate change and poverty have left to mobility in unprecedented numbers over the last decade. And whilst there is always more we can do, I'm proud that as a wealthy country, the UK is the world's second largest bilateral aid donor after the USA. I'm also very proud that British taxpayers' money is providing vital food, shelter, water and medicine for many hundreds of thousands of people the world over. Our amendment today,
Ross Greer.
I thank the member for taking an intervention. I'm wondering if he's proud that his party last week hosted a reception in this Parliament for the manufacturers of the bombs that are being dropped on these countries that force people into seeking refuge here in Europe.
Jamie Green.
It's absolutely nothing to do with the debate today, I'd say to the member, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't only Conservative MSPs who maybe attended that event, so he's welcome to make his own political point if he wants to. I am proud of the contribution that the UK makes to looking after people across the world. Our amendment notes that, and I would actually like to think that other members in this chamber accepted that as well. But in Scotland, it's important we note that charities, volunteer organisations and faith groups in particular are also playing a vital role to help migrants as they arrive in Scotland. In Inverurie, the Amal group brings together refugees with local people. They sit over traditional Arabic food and coffee and chat. In Pitlochry, local people are raising money for Médecins Sans Frontières and the Red Cross. The Church of Scotland is giving backpacks to refugee school children. In Glasgow, volunteers are delivering refugee welcome packs throughout December and January of this year. And their motto is, we're all for somewhere. Presiding Officer, we all wish to achieve migration policies which are fair and effective, which protect those in need, but also ensure that Scotland is a prosperous place to live. Some people simply choose to make a better life for themselves in Britain, simply as many Brits move abroad to do the same. So whether or not you agree or disagree with the decision to leave the EU, we should be using this opportunity to set the tone of this debate with pragmatic ideas. And we do face demographic challenges in this country, like an ageing population and the skills shortages. We should work together towards a migration system that attracts the skills we need from every part of the world on our terms. Wanting more control does not make us less humanitarian or any less outward-looking. So, in conclusion, I give my humble thanks to the migrants that have given so much to Scotland, whilst also thanking the many countries that have given Scottish migrants a home over the years. After all, we are all for somewhere.
Tom Arthur, followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm glad to have the opportunity to participate in this debate this afternoon, recognising UN International Migrants Day. It gives us an opportunity collectively to participate across the globe in recognising the contribution that migrants make to our culture, to our economies, to our universities, to society. It also gives us an opportunity to reflect upon those migrants who have been lost in transit. It gives us an opportunity to reflect not just on the impact in the countries where migrants end up, but also the countries they transit through and the countries they come from. It gives us an opportunity to reflect on those who do not leave, the families that are left behind, and that is something in Scotland we can have a lot of rich historical experience of, all the blood that flew away. I noticed that she's not in her chair. Sandra White touched on the International Organisation for Migration, which is celebrating its 65th anniversary this year. And I think it's worth recounting what the original name of that organisation was. It was the Committee for European Migration. This was an organisation that grew out of the ashes of the Second World War, and its purpose was to help and assist displaced people. And I think it's worth remembering that because it's such a vivid illustration of the consequences, or potential consequences, of a fractured Europe. I think also it's worth noting one of the last debates we'll be having in this place before the Christmas recess, that 2016 has been a year of seismic political events. The global liberal order, as Tavish Scott alluded to, has been shook to its foundations, and on all of those occasions, migration has been at the heart of those debates. Within the UK, we had Brexit. This was a campaign which was originally predicated upon the notion of sovereignty, but it quickly degraded into the demonisation of migrants. The spectators' Brexit butterfly did a first. It transmogrified back into a slug. We saw in the United States a president elected in a campaign whose central planks were the deportation of millions of migrants, the building of a wall to keep migrants out, and a commitment to ban celebrants to the world's second largest faith, the mental in the United States. And it underlines the point about the importance of language. We see the consequences that language can have, and if I could say very gently to Liam Kerr, I think he should reflect upon the rhetoric of his own party, calling for companies to be named and shamed for foreign workers, treating people as bargaining chips, and failing to guarantee the rights of EU nationals here in the UK. Perhaps he should reflect on that before coming to this chamber and lecturing people in dog whistle politics. Now, I want to touch on something that Ross Greer alluded to. He spoke about right-wing tabloids, and 2016 has also been the year of post-truth politics. This is an interesting expression, post-truth. I think at one point in the past we would have just called it a lie. But I'm going to entertain it for a moment. I'm going to use some of that philosophical training I got in university and tie it into some postmodernism. Because what post-truth is about is it's about a dogmatic relativism. It's where everything is accorded equal status, and facts and evidence disappear. We're seeing this in debates in the United States on creationism and intelligent design. We've seen it in debates about climate change. But we see it in debates about migration because how often do we hear the concrete, rational, empirical case for migration? It is so rarely. We only hear it in this chamber. We see the headlines, we see the scare stories. But when we actually bring some clarity to it, when we really consider what the impact of migration is, in Scotland, for example, of Scotland's 369,000 migrants from outside of the UK, they're mostly young, they're economically active, and they're highly qualified. As the Minister highlighted, migrants are more likely to be in work than most people born in Scotland. And migrants are not responsible for wage suppression. This myth has to be debunked once and for all. Globalisation, automation, they do have a role to play, but the solution's also to be found in globalisation. It's to be found through freedom of movement. Alexander Stewart touched upon the opportunities of Brexit, and I recalled what Mike Russell had said in Parliament a few weeks ago when confronting these issues, and he quoted from an article from, or paraphrased from an article from Mihir Sharmal, and he said in which the reality is that the economies of the future are based on people and ideas, but the UK cannot become that type of economy because of its obsession with migration. Another point that's been made is the important role that migrants play in our health and social care sector. Within the Health and Sport Committee, we've had evidence suggesting it would collapse without the role that migrants play. And we know that one of the key challenges we face is that of an ageing population. But it's worth remembering 1 in 5 of UK-born people living in Scotland are retired, but only 1% of migrants. There is much more I could say in this debate, but I wanted to join in showing solidarity with EU citizens living in Scotland and indeed across the UK, and to those migrants coming to Scotland to call it home. Kate Mila Fauci.
Daniel Johnson, followed by Rhoda Mackay.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank the Government bench for bringing forward this motion celebrating UN International Migrants Day, because migration is important for two very important reasons. One, in terms of protecting those fleeing war and persecution, and also in terms of developing our own economy. Indeed, I think Tom Arthur did a very good job describing the international situation that we have, the issues surrounding Brexit, and I think when you look at those, you realise the jeopardy that migration as an issue faces. Indeed, my views on migration are very much shaped by my family's history. My mother's maiden name was Barclay, but that's not what it should have been. Her family name had been Berkfeld, a German name, but my great-great-grandparents were interned during the First World War. The reason that they lost their liberty was because they had a German passport, they spoke German and had a German name. And that was enough living in British India for them to be deprived of their liberty. This was a stigma that meant that my great-grandfather changed his surname, never used his first name. And indeed, a shame and stigma that was passed on to my grandfather, who very proudly wore a kilt, but the reality was he had far more in common with the people of Hanover than the people of the Highlands. Indeed, I think it's easy to assume that this sort of institutionalised xenophobia and intolerance and indeed stigmatisation of others, people from other countries, is something that happens in other countries, but it's something that has happened in this country. Moreover, I think that migration is something that is essential to human beings, that we are notable as a species for our adaptability, but also the fact that we move. We are a people that have moved from Africa through Asia, across the Bering Strait, populating the Americas and down to Australia. It is quite remarkable, our ability to do that. Indeed, I think Scotland in turn has a particular status. And Sandra White mentioned that we are a country of mongrels. I'd go further. I'd say Scotland is actually named for migrants because, as the Venerable Bede chronicled, the Scots moved from Spain through Ireland before eventually settling in Scotland. But it was also one of the first issues that was raised for me by a constituent. An EU citizen, a French woman, worried about her ability to stay in this country following the Brexit vote. And it's perhaps not surprising given that in my constituency, as much as 10% of the population are from the EU. We have a strong base in education, professional services, tourism and technology. And Brexit has created a very real worry. But it's also against a backdrop where migration is happening now on a scale that we've never seen before. I mean, some people have talked about numbers, but according to the UN, that on an annual basis, 232 million people move between countries. If you include internal migration, that increases to 740 million. That's a huge proportion of the world's population moving every single year, and a sign of our increasingly globalised culture and economy. A sign of the strife and poverty, with 19 million of those people being refugees, 4 million from Syria. And I think others have very well highlighted those issues, including James Dornan, Tavish Scott and Polly McNeill. So I won't do that here, because I think one of the things we need to do, on top of protecting the protections that we afford refugees, is celebrating the benefits of immigration to our own economy. Because migration allows our economy to adapt, grow and innovate. It adapts by filling the needs that are created in our economy, not least of which through the ageing population. We know what a valuable contribution foreign workers make within our health service in nursing and medicine. But I think we have to be very careful not to describe those with certificates and degrees as being good migrants and those with lesser skills being less welcome, because it's right the way across our economy we need skills and people, because our population pyramid has gone from a pyramid to a column to an inverted pyramid. We have an ageing population which needs support. Indeed, Alexander Stewart contrasted Scottish growth with the rest of the UK. Now, there are many reasons for that. Uncertainty is one. But one of them is because we have attracted less migrants into our economy. And that's a well-established economic fact. But in innovation too, in growing occupations, as many as 15% of people working in those are from other countries. Edinburgh has become a high-tech hub for technology companies. And those companies welcome people from other countries for two reasons. One, because it allows them to cluster skills here in Edinburgh, people who are specialists and experts in the area, but also by having people from other parts of the world, they are able to face the world. They are globalised, despite the fact they are based in Edinburgh. But I also like to mention our universities. Again, I'm very lucky to have the King's Buildings from Edinburgh, one of the campuses of Edinburgh University in my constituency. And I think universities are perhaps our longest, most enduring global institutions. They're historically international, and indeed at Edinburgh University, 17% of staff are EU nationals, 25% are academics, 14% of its students are from the EU. But the impact of Brexit is this. They've seen a fall-off in applications for vacancies from across other parts of the world. They apparently, according to people, that they are being gently encouraged not to be part of funding applications with other international universities. And the reality is this, is that our knowledge relies on international exchange of understanding and benefits. So I realise my time is coming to an end, but I think it is important we celebrate immigration in its fullest sense and not try to claim that there's good and bad immigration.
Time is getting really tight now, so can I ask for under the 6 minutes, please? Rona Mackay, to be followed by Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My colleague Sandra White actually stole my introduction, but I think it's worth repeating, so I'm going to say it again. The late Willie McIlvany famously said, "Scotland's not full and we're a mongrel nation." Both statements are, of course, true. Scotland was founded by immigrants, and we all have immigrant ancestors somewhere down the line in our family tree. But as well as being a mongrel nation, Scotland's also a welcoming nation. It's in our DNA to welcome people, particularly those in crisis or distress. It's anathema to us to turn away people in need if we can help them when they're seeking refuge. As has been said in this chamber many times, the current situation in Aleppo, Yemen and other parts of the world ravaged by war and terrorism is a humanitarian crisis. Scotland has proportionally punched way above its weight when it comes to taking on refugees, with the numbers we have welcomed topping more than 1,200. As Ross Greer said, my own local authority in Eastern Bartonshire have at long last agreed to take 4 families and 4 unaccompanied children, and I look forward to being part of the welcoming committee to help them integrate when they arrive early next year. But of course, welcoming immigrants doesn't just mean providing refuge. It means welcoming people from any part of the world who want to come and work here and contribute to Scotland's economy and culture. Presiding Officer, I don't think there's any reason to differentiate between immigrants or refugees. Who would want to start a new life in a country and get a pittance to live on with the most basic accommodation and second-hand furniture and handouts? Immigrants, refugees and asylum seekers want to work and should be encouraged to work for their own dignity and well-being. These are families who deserve no less than us. They have pride and want the best for their children. Why would they not? When it comes to welcoming migrant workers, why wouldn't we do so with open arms? As has been said many times during this debate, migrant workers contribute immensely to the Scottish economy and culture. In fact, without migrant workers, we would face a serious shortfall in skilled and unskilled workers. Yes.
Liam Kerr.
Just for the record, does Rona Mackay then disagree with Nicola Sturgeon when Nicola Sturgeon says that an independent Scotland would not have an unmanaged immigration, and nobody is suggesting an uncontrolled and unmanaged immigration?
Rona Mackay.
I didn't even allude to that, and I actually don't think you're in any position of strength to talk about our policy on this issue. So why does the Tory Westminster government make it so difficult for them to come and work here? Since Brexit, they've given workers and EU citizens no security, preferring instead to adopt the I will if you will mentality, insisting that workers from this country are given security in their countries. What utter hypocrisy and arrogance. The Tory government gambled with our European identity and lost, and now they think they can set the rules. The fact is that Brexit is a no-win situation. We're all losers, and that's why our First Minister and excellent European Cabinet team are working so hard to give Scotland access to the single market, so vitally important to our economy and cultural well-being. Why would we want to be an insular country, cutting ourselves off from trading and interacting at all levels with our European neighbours? That's the path that this right-wing government are going down, but we will never follow them. Europe is too important for us for all the reasons that have been mentioned in this passionate debate today. Presiding Officer, on June the 23rd this year, on the steps of Bute House, the First Minister said that all our EU citizens were welcome in Scotland. She said what we were all thinking, what all right-minded people were thinking in the depths of our shock and despair at the news that we were to be dragged out of Europe. The indisputable facts are that international migrants make important economic, social and cultural contributions to our communities, and the UK government's focus on arbitrarily reducing net migration is entirely wrong for Scotland. I certainly wouldn't want to live in a country where the shutters went up and we were unable to benefit from international migrants culturally and economically, just as much as I wouldn't want to live in a country that did not welcome families fleeing from war and persecution with open arms. And I have every confidence, I'm in the last paragraph, I have every confidence that the Scottish Government will never allow that. Scotland will always be open for business and open for refuge. I support this motion.
Rachel Hamilton, to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Firstly, let me acknowledge the UN International Migrants Day and remember the refugees and migrants who lost their lives while trying to reach safe harbour. Today, I would like to focus on an amendment within the Scottish Conservative motion that the Scottish Government has significant powers to create incentives to live and work in Scotland. National identity is a hotly discussed topic in Scotland. The 2014 referendum challenged national identity. If Scotland were to separate, could those who identify as British Scottish still claim to be so? As members may not know, I grew up in Wales, and as members will have heard, I have an English accent. I have been asked how this combination is received in Scottish Parliament, but let me say this. I have been in Scotland for 26 years. Prior to the Parliament, I helped run a business with my husband in the Scottish borders. My 3 children are Scottish, and I feel as much as Scottish as they do. If these questions are asked of me, how am I welcomed, then the same questions will have been directed to others from further afield. I will further develop this opinion later. We must in this Parliament echo the words of Ruth Davison and say we want the values, the brains and the culture of all those who come to Scotland, and indeed to call our country their home. We must work harder to encourage new talent to Scotland if we are to achieve what we need to do in terms of population growth and labour shortages and cultural diversity. As mentioned before, EU migrants make a valuable contribution and help labour shortages. 80% of EU nationals are working age compared to 65% of the Scottish population as a whole. and as such more likely to be economically active. Deputy Presiding Officer, migrants should not be underestimated and the benefit that they bring to Scotland. They plug shortages in unskilled and skilled labour, enrich our lives with diversity and help grow our population. I'm aware of the importance of EU migrants in the hospitality industry. From my own experience in this sector, almost a third of EU nationals are employed in jobs linked to distribution, hotels and restaurants. Of those, 20,000 work within the accommodation and food sectors, typically carrying out roles in bar work, waiting and housekeeping. Indeed, the Food and Drink Federation say that the industry could not function without EU migrants. Workforce planning is crucial. Every week we hear of impending shortages to key services. I'll finish this sentence and I'll give way. And as our constituents tell us, we already know shortages are present in the health and social care sector too. I'll give way to the member.
Daniel Johnson.
I thank the member for highlighting people working in the hospitality sector, but there are also sectors where workers often find themselves exploited. Would the member therefore support the Labour amendment looking for protection of workers' rights who migrate from other countries?
Rachel Hamilton.
Currently, the protection of workers' rights are higher in some circumstances than the EU requirements and regulations that are set out. In particular, we have the Working Directive. I would ask the Scottish Government whether it would be doing more to focus on workforce planning and to help alleviate the current shortages and focus on skilling up our young workforce. EU migrant labour is also key to agriculture and horticulture sector. The crux of the problem that rural areas have is a shortage of local seasonal labourers to pick their products at its freshest. In this regard, migrant labour is essential. I met with an East Lothian mushroom grower and he employs 283 people, mainly from Poland and Bulgaria. Without these labourers, the business would struggle to harvest in time. Last week, we heard evidence in the European Committee from Professor Rebecca Kay. Her paper set out a study for social support and migration in Scotland. The project explores experience of migration and settlement amongst migrants from Central and Eastern Europe living in Scotland. We talk much about welcoming migrants, but the report found issues around migrants settling in, loneliness and isolation, and migrants from Eastern European countries are clustered in low-skilled, low-paid employment. Career progression is difficult, especially in rural areas. These aspects need to improve if we really want to make Scotland a place that welcomes all. Yes.
Pauline McNeill.
I don't disagree with a single word the member has said in her speech so far, but no one in the Conservative benches so far has mentioned in the contribution the moral responsibility that we have, not just to migrants who have something to offer, but those who flee for safety. And I wonder if the member is going to address that at some point.
Rachel Hamilton.
I say to Pauline McNeill that I have mentioned the social and cultural diversity that migrants bring to our country, and I'm not in any way, shape or form saying that other than the skills shortage, which I have defined as an issue, and the population growth within Scotland, that I do not value migrants in other senses. I don't know where I am now. The Scottish Government must set out their requirements in a rational immigration system where people are matched to skills. Gathering sectorial data is essential for workforce planning. The Scottish Government must concentrate on growing the economy. There won't be jobs to fill our economy if our economy doesn't grow, and productivity will stay static. I believe that a solution to this is in skilling up our workforce. That is investing in the future of this country. It's ensuring that measures are in place that will guarantee all sectors and industry will not suffer from labour shortages. It's promoting what Scotland has to offer and giving those the opportunities to make life better. But to do that, Deputy Presiding Officer, the SNP government has to acknowledge the issues prevalent in Scotland's workforce first and seek to resolve them. Not, as is all often the case, claim the Scottish Government is powerless to do anything.
Now move to the last of the open speeches. Claire Adamson, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I do want to talk about some of the Syrian refugees who have come to my own area. But before doing that, I just want to touch on some of the things that have come up in this afternoon's debate. I very much thank Jamie Green for taking the intervention. I would say that From my own point of view, while I can see very different reasons for people coming to live and work in this country, what we do in Scotland is embrace them. When they are here, they are all new Scots. Once they are here, we don't make the distinction because they are our friends and our neighbours and they are welcome in our country. On the issue touched on by Rachel Hamilton about skills shortages, earlier in the debate, the Tory benches were talking about migrants who make a contribution being welcome. I don't know where these migrants who don't make a contribution are. They're not visible to me in Scotland. And Mr Green mentioned particularly the software industry, which is, of course, my own area. And I know there are great skill shortages there. But I also know from speaking to the NFU farmers last week that there is shortages in soft fruit picking as well and in our farms. And they all make a contribution. And one should not be valued any more than another. So whether it's software or soft fruit, migrants should be welcome when they come to work here. And yes, there are reasons for people seeking new lives, going to Canada. I've got our own families. I'm sure there are many people who have families who have gone elsewhere. But as someone who have Irish heritage, I'm sure that there are also people from my families a few generations back who had to flee potato famine, or people in Scotland who had to flee because of the Highland clearances. And we know, for the many reasons of war and our current situation, that there are many, many reasons why people choose to move and work in other areas. Presiding Officer, just over a year ago, I was asked by my good friend Bush Richbal, someone who is no stranger to this place, having delivered time for reflection in the last session of the Parliament. She invited me to Airdrie Mosque to a celebration of welcome to the first Syrian refugees to be welcomed in North Lanarkshire. I was delighted to attend. It was a truly uplifting experience with the community represented by local schools, police and fire, local churches and mosques, those of faith and of no faith, North Lanarkshire Council officers and elected members, all who gathered to offer friendship and support to the families who had sought refuge in this country. It was no surprise to me that North Lanarkshire Council's Syrian Resettlement Project was awarded Team of the Year for Excellence in Housing by the Chartered Institute of Housing Scotland. In preparation for the arrival, the Syrian Resettlement Project was established, involving housing, social work and other council services, together with NHS Lanarkshire, local voluntary organisations, housing associations, police and fire services, in recognition of the continuing support that would be needed to the families, giving them confidence and promoting their independence within our communities. I was not surprised by this success, Presiding Officer, because North Lanarkshire has a great history in welcoming also Congolese refugees in 2007. And it's also a great success in our communities. Now, success doesn't mean it hasn't been without problems. As you can imagine, there are always those who are uneducated and stupid enough not to welcome people, but thankfully, in both situations, these have very much been a minority.
Would the member take an intervention?
Yes, certainly.
Fulton Mackenzie.
Thank you to my colleague for taking an intervention. I welcome my colleague taking time to highlight those refugees settled in North Lanarkshire, and she may be aware that just a couple of weeks ago I had the pleasure of welcoming those from Coatbridge to a tour of the Parliament. Would the member agree that now that I've been in Scotland for about a year, that the priority for the UK Government, the Parliament and the local authorities is continuing to help them settle and deal with the trauma that many of them have faced?
Claire Adamson.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with the member's points, and many of the people who have come have had to have suffered from violence, from torture, and have required additional help from specialist services because of post-traumatic stress disorder. Remember, these Syrian families were brought from the refugee camps and are some of those most in need, with some of their children having really, really difficult conditions and medical conditions to deal with. And I'm very glad that North Lanarkshire is continuing to offer that support. Indeed, I had my very own visitor last week to the Parliament. My local GP practice undertakes an exchange with the American University in Beirut, offering a 4-week placement with people who are studying family health there, who will become the equivalent of our GPs. It's been going for a number of years, but this year there was a problem. Guraith, who had applied and been successful and accepted on the programme, was denied a visa by the UK government because he was a Syrian national. Now, with the help of my colleague and friend Marion Fellows asking questions in the Commons and pursuing this case, he was eventually given his visa to attend. And I think this is just an example of how UK immigration stands in the way rather than facilitates that cultural and knowledge exchange that is so vital as we move forward. It was very heartening to see him, and also very sad to know that he had not been able to return home for 3 years to visit his parents who were in Aleppo. Presiding Officer, we should all be remembered we are Jock Tamson's bairns, but we should also aspire to be Glasgow girls too.
We now move to the closing speeches, and a call on Anna Sarwar. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I first of all start by thanking the Government and indeed the Minister, Alistair Allen, for bringing forward today's debate. I think it's been a fantastic debate and had some really strong contributions from all benches. I certainly want to welcome the UN International Migrants Day, which will be taking place on Sunday, and I'd like to echo the comments made by Alistair Allen and so many others to say that this Parliament should put on its record that we thank all those people that have chosen to make Scotland their home, no matter where they come from. As Daniel Johnson and Claire Adamson have both said, we all have our own personal stories about whether that's relatives or people who have treated us in a public service, whether that be in our NHS, about how a migrant or migration has impacted on our lives. Myself, I'm a third-generation migrant myself. My grandfather came here in the 1940s, fleeing the poverty of pre-partition India, looking to make a better life for himself and his family. He arrived in the south of England, looking for a place to settle, and travelled north. And of all the places, he picked sunny and Lossiemouth to set home, and that became the home for my mother and my family. Now, his intention was always to return home, but like so many others, he fell in love with Scotland and chose to bring his own family here. I think that's a story that's probably replicated by so many families, whether they're Irish families or families from other parts of the world too. And I think we should pay tribute to all those people that have helped make the tapestry of Scotland what it is today. Sandra White rightly mentioned Glasgow. I think we have a shining example of how we can create diverse and open communities that welcomes all those people, who says that when you arrive here, no matter your background, no matter your race, no matter your religion, you are part of the One Glasgow approach. And I think we've seen that from the leadership that Glasgow has shown around its support for migrants, but also its support for refugees, particularly the Kosovan refugees, or indeed refugees from Syria, who we're now supporting too. I also want to echo the comments made by Tom Arthur, who said that we shouldn't be using our EU citizens that are here as bargaining chips. I think all of us should send a strong message to the UK Government and to Theresa May, the Prime Minister, that we expect the rights of every single EU national already here in the United Kingdom to be protected and guaranteed, and that should be done without delay. Happy to take an intervention.
Jamie Green.
I'm sure you weren't clapping me there. Just to confirm, what is Labour's position then on our amendment that the EU should protect the interests of UK nationals, including many Scots who currently live in the EU? And if you won't support that, why not?
Anna Sarwar.
Well, of course, I think that the UK should protect the rights of every EU national, and I think the EU should protect the rights of UK nationals. I think that is a pretty simple concept to understand. I was going to just mention Jamie Green actually in my next comment, which was I actually agree with what Jamie Green was saying around the conflation between refugees and migrants. I'm not for a second suggesting it as any kind of criticism to anybody or implying any kind of ill intent, but I do think we should be careful about not mixing migrants as and refugees, because there are clear differences and challenges. A refugee is a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution or natural disaster, while a migrant is a person who moves from one place to another in order to find work or a better living circumstance or conditions. And I think we just need to be careful about the two. But on the issues of refugees, James Dornan quite rightly said, as did Polly McNeill, as did Tavish Scott, about the sacrifice that so many people have made as refugees trying to flee conflict and war. Currently we see it in Syria, but we've seen it before in Iraq, we've seen it before in Afghanistan, we've seen it before in Bosnia. And I've got to say, Deputy Presiding Officer, for a country that's not slow to get involved with war, I don't think we should be slow in supporting people that are the victims of war too, and that's why we should be welcoming refugees into this country with open arms. Lewis MacDonald rightly talked about the economic interest. He rightly pointed out about migrants can also be exploited, whether they be underpaid by employers, ripped off by landlords or trafficked. We have many of these problems, for example, currently being investigated in Govan Hill in Glasgow, and I think that's something that needs to be reflected on. Joan McAlpine and Rona Mackay and Rachel Hamilton quite rightly spoke about the economic benefits of migrants. Joan in particular speaking of the ageing population and the requirement to have migrants coming into the country. I think that's something that we can all support on all sides of this chamber, particularly for economic purposes, but also if you look at the support that we get in our NHS from people coming from other parts of the world. Lewis also mentioned the powers. I think if we did have two governments that are willing to work together, we can find a model to try and support our needs like we did with the Fresh Challenge scheme before us. And I just want to close and talk a bit about the challenges. I don't think it's right for us just to talk about the rosy picture of migration. There are also challenges. One is tackling the myths around benefit scroungers. The reality is migrants contribute more to this economy than they take back, and I think we should say that loudly. Secondly, we should openly challenge the right-wing media who would happily let you believe that they're only benefit scroungers coming here and not people helping to drive our economy. We should take on the far right head-on who try to foster prejudice and racism in our country or Islamophobia, and let them know that the people not welcome here are them and their views, not the migrants that choose to come. And I think we can proactively work together to expose the failures of the Tory immigration system that is heartless, that is treating people unfairly, as Ross Greer quite rightly said, and instead say that we can build an immigration system that welcomes people here, whether they're coming here for the building their economy or indeed people fleeing conflict just to make a better life for themselves.
We'll call on Ross Thompson. Up to 6 minutes, please, Mr Thompson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'd like to declare an interest as a councillor on Aberdeen City Council. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the comments of my colleague Liam Kerr in his opening speech this afternoon, where we say that we welcome that the Parliament acknowledges the UN's International Migrants Day on the 18th of December, because it is so important that we recognise the tragic loss of life that there has been for those who have tried to reach our shores and other places to reach and finally secure freedom. Deputy Presiding Officer, it's really important that we take head-on some of the arguments that were made during the debate this afternoon, particularly about rhetoric and stirring up emotions during the EU referendum campaign, by the Leave campaign, and those who voted for Brexit, as was mentioned by Joe McAlpine and Tom Arthur. I think we need to be absolutely clear that this SNP government have consistently and unashamedly attempted to paint a false image of Leave voters, including 400,000 of their own voters, as anti-immigration, anti-globalisation nativists. And believe me, they noticed when the First Minister declared Scotland voted Remain in order to be an open, inclusive and outward-looking society. And therefore, all those who voted Leave automatically represented the opposite. In her rhetoric, the First Minister has painted Leave voters as the other. In fact, following the comments of Mike Russell in Brussels, it's clear that the SNP are trying to airbrush the 1 million Scottish Leave voters from history. To address Pauline McNeill's point, people in Scotland who voted to leave did so not just for migration, but they did so for a variety of reasons. But yes, one of them was to create a fairer system of immigration, which is fit for purpose in the age of globalisation. Lewis MacDonald, in his... well, which one?
Claire Adamson.
Thank you for taking the intervention. I hear what the member is saying, but can the member explain why then he is not asking his Tory colleagues to reinstate the post-study work visa, which worked so well and was a fair system of immigration?
Ross Thompson.
If the member had been paying attention to my remarks, as well as the remarks of my colleague Liz Smith, you'll see that the work we have been doing, lobbying UK government, and we've been very active on that particular front, probably more so than some of our colleagues on our benches there. In relation to Lewis MacDonald, he stated in his opening remarks about the devastating impact of Brexit on migration and that we need to reject the Tory fallacy of caps on migration. So I do want to address these points head-on, because the EU rules on free movement are, at their core, inherently unfair. It is a ridiculous notion that by the simple fact of your birth in an EU member state, you have the right to move without restriction throughout the European Union, regardless of your skills or capability to contribute to your chosen state, society and economy. Meanwhile, highly skilled workers from other parts of the world have to jump through hoops to get in. The burden imposed on our economy and public services by uncontrolled free movement and large pockets of unskilled labour from Europe has meant we have to turn away people from other parts of the world who have vital skills, which could contribute enormously to our society.
Sorry, it's Lewis MacDonald.
Thank you very much. Does Mr Thompson not appreciate that the point and purpose of free movement among neighbouring countries is in order to increase the solidarity and the community of those countries? Is that not a principle he applies to the United Kingdom? And if he does, why does he not apply it to the European Union?
Ross Thompson.
In the northeast of Scotland, Mr MacDonald, which we both represent, we, as you know, are unable to access the necessary levels of skilled labour from outside the EU to populate our undermanned fishing vessels, fill our teacher shortages in our schools, or support the renaissance in our oil and gas industry because of EU free movement, which is inherently unfair and inward-looking. The UK has decided to take a path which allows skilled migrants from right across the world to come to the UK to fill our skills gaps and help take our economy forward. In relation to the comments of, I would like to make some progress, please. It's 4 minutes in. In relation to what Liam Kerr in saying that the UK government has a track record to meet its commitment to resettle 20,000 Syrian refugees by 2020. That's something I'm really proud of. The UK government has played a leading role in ensuring that refugees from Syria are resettled here with the housing and healthcare and infrastructure that they need. And I am proud to have played my own role in this as an Aberdeen City Councillor, where the Community Planning Partnership has in fact worked together to ensure that Syrian refugee families are supported within our communities to adjust to their new life in Scotland. And since settling in the city, and it touches on the point raised by James Dornan, we've heard of the horror stories of beheadings and starvation and crucifixion at the hands of ISIS, of families who have been starving to death, who have no food, no electricity, and of the devastation that has been caused by war, which has driven them to leave their home. Therefore, I am proud that Aberdeen is playing its vital and important role in making our multicultural city home to 100 Syrian refugees. Sandra White said that Scotland is different and that we need a much more flexible approach to immigration. Well, I think it's worth making the point to Sandra White that Scotland is not that different. According to the Oxford University Migration Observatory, 58% of Scots support reduced immigration to Scotland. In 2015, a YouGov poll found that 49% of Scots want less immigration, exactly the same proportion as across Britain. Further, I could forgive the member if for perhaps you didn't want to take my word for it, but perhaps you'll take the word of the First Minister, who said, and I quote, "There are not radically different views on immigration between Scotland and the rest of the UK." Tavish Scott mentioned the situation in Aleppo, of which we all know remains dire and desperate. But in relation to the status of EU migrants, let's be clear that just as the Law Society of Scotland has reiterated, the UK government has stated that EU nationals who have lived continuously and lawfully in the UK for at least 5 years automatically have a permanent right to reside. This means that they have a right to live in the UK permanently. In relation to those who have not lived here for 5 years, we all agree, and I am sure that those EU nationals living and working and contributing in Scotland should stay, just as those living and working in the rest of Europe should also stay. So, Presiding Officer...
No, I think you're finished now, Mr
Thank
Thompson.
you very much. Even with all those interventions.
We're rather pushed for time. I now call on Alistair Allen. Up to 8 minutes, please, Minister.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been an important debate and a largely rational one. Something that's worth saying, obviously, in the current political climate. And I hope that the points raised have set a precedent across the UK to encourage politicians to approach immigration in a constructive and sensible manner. Indeed, members from across the chamber generally struck a thoughtful and well-judged tone, Mr Kerr's efforts notwithstanding. So may I begin, however, by referring to a point made by Lewis MacDonald, where he rightly pointed out that Scots have formed, as it were, on being migrants over the last 200 years, and where Scots are found the world over. And others have pointed to this history that we share, and the family histories, indeed, of Daniel Johnson, Rachel Hamilton, Claire Adamson, Anna Sarwar and others pointed to this. We're here because it's International Migrants Day, which was established in 2000, and there has been a 41% increase, since 2000 in the number of migrants across the world. This figure underlines the significant responsibility that we share in working to protect the rights of all migrants in Scotland and across the globe. Now, members have joined me today in expressing our sincere sadness for those who have lost their lives while searching for peace and for an improved standard of living. It's vital that we never forget what has happened and what continues to happen in the Mediterranean, as Pauline McNeill and many others have referred to. We will continue to do all that we can to address this devastating humanitarian crisis, and that includes continuing to play our part in the refugee resettlement programme. Yes?
Pauline McNeill.
I would like to put on the record that the Scottish Government announced that it would be giving £250,000 towards DEC for the people of Yemen, which we believe almost 10 million people are starving because of the war efforts there. So I'd just like to put that on the record.
Alistair Allen.
Well, the Scottish Government has been pleased to assist in Yemen and are very proud of the role that, in a modest way, we can play to help alleviate some of that suffering.
Mr Allen, may I stop you for a moment? It's all right, don't panic. May I ask all of those who are coming into the chamber, please not to have private conversations when you do so, so that we can hear the Minister. Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to say that we will continue to urge the UK Government to do more to increase the number of refugees that it will take. It is our belief that the UK Government should be willing to take refugees from amongst those who have fled to Europe, as well as those in camps in countries neighbouring Syria. And to pick up on a specific question raised by Mr Greer, the Cabinet Secretary for Communities continues to urge UK Government to improve the accommodation provided to asylum seekers, something which was recently raised by the UK Parliament's Home Affairs Committee. Today we also recognise the hugely valuable contribution of those who come to Scotland more generally, and we're grateful to welcome these people to Scotland who enrich our culture, our economy and our own traditions. And it's very positive that so many new Scots want to learn about Scotland's culture and to be a distinctive part of it. And following a year which has seen so much anti-immigrant rhetoric doing the rounds, it is very important that the Scottish Parliament has ended the year with such a positive debate, showing our firm commitment to welcoming and valuing all people who choose to make Scotland their home. In particular, I'm proud that the Scottish Parliament has today acknowledged the impact of the EU referendum on some of this debate. So I hope that the UK Government will finally take note and give the EU citizens in Scotland the reassurances they need about their future. We're proud that others have chosen to make Scotland the place they call home, and also appreciate the benefits of freedom of movement enjoyed by our own citizens, such as the right to free movement to live, study and work in all EU countries, and to benefit from their public services. And so it is therefore imperative that the Scottish Government is treated as an equal partner and centrally involved in developing the UK Government's negotiating position on Europe, in which any move to seriously restrict freedom of movement will be opposed by myself and by other Scottish Government ministers, a point which Mr Russell and I both made to UK ministers in London last week. Currently, Scotland's population is projected to grow by 7% between 2014 and 2039. However, we're in a situation in which, or we could be in a situation where if EU migration to Scotland stopped completely, population would only be projected to grow by 3%. And that, perhaps hypothetical as it is, does illustrate why, amongst many other reasons, Scotland needs to be welcoming towards people from other countries who choose to live here. There are many other points I could cover, but I do want to touch on the post-study work visa, and can I take the opportunity to agree with the points made by many members about the importance of creating such an arrangement for Scotland. This is a point that I raised with Immigration Minister Robert Goodwill in the last few days. I have to say, in response to comments from the Tory benches, I have to say this government is working very hard to resolve this issue. I hope the UK government is doing so likewise. But I want really to conclude by saying that whilst we welcome returning to the issue of the refugee question, whilst we welcome UK support for humanitarian actions in Greece and in the wider Mediterranean, we do urge the Prime Minister to reconsider her position and participate in EU-led relocation in respect of the many people in need of protection. It is hugely disappointing that the UK Government has chosen not to participate fully in the EU's collective efforts, and that is a matter of some regret. I want to come to a conclusion in the few seconds I have remaining, really to say that today has been a great chance to reflect on the contribution of people from other countries who have chosen to make Scotland their home. It is imperative that the UK Government stops treating those who are EU nationals as human bargaining chips and instead acknowledges their highly valuable contribution to our nation. And for those and many other reasons, I would urge all members to support the motion, and I move it in my name.
Thank you, and we go straight to decision time. There are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business, and I would remind members that if the amendment in the name of Liam Kerr is agreed to, then the amendment in the name of Lewis MacDonald falls. And the first question is that Amendment 3049.2 in the name of Liam Kerr, which seeks to amend Motion 3049 in the name of Alistair Allen on welcoming international migrants in Scotland, be agreed. Are we all agreed? We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote, and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 3049.2 in the name of Liam Kerr is yes 27, no 85. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And the next question is that amendment 3049.1 in the name of Lewis MacDonald, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Alistair Allen, be agreed. Are we all agreed? We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote, and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote in the name of Lewis MacDonald is yes 84, no 27. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. And the final question is that motion 3049 in the name of Alistair Allen as amended be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote, and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on the motion in the name of Alistair Allen as amended is yes 84, no 27. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. That concludes decision time. We'll now move to members' debate from Fulton McGregor, and I'll take just a few moments to change for ministers and others to change seats.